Boker Tov, Chodesh Tov. There's a variety of things that go without saying, that our hearts are aching and that we are all feeling anxious, and we're all praying for the success of our boys and girls, our children, our grandchildren, our friends, our neighbors. We've not stopped doing so from a week ago. There's been plenty tears, and there's been plenty cries out to God, and there's been too many funerals. I'd love to talk about that, but at the same time, I know we have a task. We have a task to learn. And precisely because we have a task to learn, I want to tell you that the words are insufficient, the time is insufficient. So given this, I feel that we should use every minute we can to learn. B'zchut Am Yisrael, and that please God, through our limud, it should make some minor contribution to the world that is, to make it a better world. Let me give you an introduction of what we're doing, because our first class of this new course had a different vision in time. In fact, I've changed it significantly in order to adapt to where we are emotionally and where we are physically here on Zoom. Let me give you a 1-minute précis about what we're doing, and then we're going to just jump in, okay? So a few months ago, I suggested to Melissa that we learn a sefer, the one I have in front of me, Minchat Asher, Kללי, המצוות, written by Rav Asher. In this sefer are a variety of chapters, each dealing with a different halachic concept. And in each chapter, Rav Asher Weiss goes through a huge amount of sources and explains this principle with the kind of clarity that we're so familiar with. And I want us to get into this sefer, because this sefer helps us get into the reasoning, the approach to halacha, helps us understand concepts in a way which most other Sfarim don't do so. That's the plan. Initially, I suggested that we learn from the first chapter, that we'd go straight through. But the first chapter is a little bit longer, and it doesn't lend itself to be learning online. So I decided for us to jump to a different chapter, and probably as a result, we'll learn different chapters all over, based on whichever week and based on whichever setting we're in. And given this, we're going to jump and we're going to learn straight away Perek Chaf Dalet. So here is the front page of Minchat Asher, Kללי, המצוות, Moran Rabbeinu Gaon Rav Asher Weiss. This is published in Tafshin Ayin Chet. And we're going to leap to chapter 24, Siman Chaf Dalet. And we're going to discuss something which is just so relevant to us in this moment, in this time. Meaning, I chose this Perek over Shabbos because I realized it spoke to us, very much speaks to me in terms of the way in which I feel pulled in so many different directions in this moment and at this time. So I hope you can see my screen. I'll actually enlarge the text to make it a little bit larger. Hopefully you can now see it even better. And I'll explain just the format of this sefer, and then we're going to kick off. Just to let you know, there was also a supplementary document with a couple of Gemaras, which he only provides in Aramaic, so I provided the translation, and we'll look at those as and when. But every chapter of Minchat Asher Kללי המצוות begins with a topic. In this case, it's Chovat HaYachid Mitzvot HaTzibur. What is the duty of the individual for mitzvot that fall upon the responsibility of a community? That's a hugely important topic, and couldn't be more relevant than right now. And then he begins with either a source or a query. In this case, it's a query, which he's going to use basically as a prompt to address this topic. And then every chapter has different sections. Aleph, what he does is he looks at a case study of tzedakah in order to discuss this question of the duty of the individual vis-a-vis mitzvot for the community. Then at some point later, he's looking at a different mitzvah or a different source. In this case, it's a mitzvah, that of Eruvei Chatzerot. What we're going to do is look through each section and review the material, discuss it. And as we'll see, after each section, he's kind of helping up build an argument to make sense of this question of Chovat HaYachid Mitzvat HaTzibur, the duties of an individual for mitzvot that fall upon the community. So, just before we kick off, are there any questions just about the things I've said? I'm sure there are lots of other questions. Any questions about the things I've said, feel free to ask now. Fine. I'm going to be sharing my screen. For those that have the Sefer, wonderful. For those who printed out the material, wonderful. But let's begin. And we begin with a query that he's asked to address, or he chooses to address. במה ששאל דעתי, באיזה מידה מצווה מועל לצרוך טרחה יתרה להוציא הצעות כגון לעזוב בביתו להתארח בעיר אחרת בשבת, כדי לקיים את המוטל עליו במצווה נשגבה זו להכניס ילדי ישראל לבריתו של אברהם אבינו. Let me explain this in my own words. He's been asked a query by a male, by a person who does Brit Milah, either as a living or does so voluntarily. And the question is, to what extent should this individual male put themselves out in order to help a family fulfill the mitzvah of circumcising their child? Meaning, if a person is a male and they're asked to travel a half an hour to go somewhere, in general, they do so, and that's part and parcel of the exercise, part and parcel of what they've offered to do, either for pay or for nothing. But what happens if you're a male, and in order to do the Brit Milah for a particular family, or a particular child of a particular family, you have to travel for many hours. You may even need to take a flight. You may need to stay there a couple of days. And even if they pay you a little bit of money, it certainly doesn't cover all of the extra effort. And so the question that he's asked to address is, to what extent should this individual male feel an obligation to fulfill a mitzvah which actually falls upon others, but they are considered to be an agent to fulfill that mitzvah? Now, why did I say this is so resonant for our current situation? I've spoken to so many people the past few weeks. It feels like hundreds of years already, who feel a duty to carry the load of a community, who feel that there is food that needs to be packaged, that money needs to be gathered, right? That resources need to be delivered, and they do quite really. But there are people, perhaps friends of yours, perhaps you yourself, who feel an obligation to take on more than ordinarily you would do, because you feel the yoke of the kahal, you feel the yoke of the community of the right here, our society. You feel that I've got to do this, even though it's broader than my shoulders. And sadly, there are people who are actually doing harm to themselves by taking on more than they can cope with. I've spoken to people who, unfortunately, by feeling the duty to pick up more than they can deal with, it's actually making them physically weaker, emotionally more drained, and it's not good for them, and it's not good, shall we say, for the war effort. And so figuring out what are our individual duties in terms of mitzvot that fall on society or community or yeshuv or kibbutz or whatever, that's our question, and to say incredibly relevant one. Rav Asher Weiss continues by saying, but Shuvat Sheila Zu, in order to answer this question, צריך אני להרחיב את היריעה, להאריך קצת, כי שאלה זו נוגעת לא רק למצווה זו בלבד. He says this question, though we're specifically asking about Brit Milah and a male, doesn't just address Brit Milah and male, אלא כל המצוות המוטלות על הציבור. Instead, this is a wider question. How should an individual respond to mitzvot applying to a community? מה מידת החיוב המוטל על כל יחיד ויחיד בקיום מצוות אלה? He's saying, this book is called כללי המצוות, right? The rules of mitzvot. And so, though there's an individual question, his answer requires him to make sense of this, shall we say, calculation. How much must we do for mitzvot that don't just fall on us? Meaning, if I'm supposed to make kiddush, then that falls on me. But in terms of Brit Milah, unless it's your child, that's not your mitzvah. So how far must you go? And as he's going to see, there's lots of other examples too. Hopefully that introduction is clear. And then what he does is he goes from sugya to sugya, and shall we say collates information to help answer this question, or to help us get a better understanding of the klal, the rule of this principle. Now you may well say, well, it's obvious. I promise you it's not obvious. And the more you learn Sfarim like this, you realize nothing's particularly obvious. And there is an art of knowing how to read texts. And the reason we're learning this Sefer is this is one of the greatest experts in so doing. So he's going to be teaching us not just how to paskin, but in particular how to learn texts to draw out what he believes to be the right conclusion. And Rav Asher Weiss is bold enough to say, when he sometimes quotes other people, this person said this, and I think he's wrong. I think he's just read the text incorrectly. I don't think he's got the klal of the mitzvah correct. And all too often, people leap to certain conclusions, leading to bad outcomes. And as I wrote in a Facebook post a couple of days ago, especially when it comes down to milchama, if you're, for example, this is a different matter altogether, but the way in which you practice law as an individual is very different to the way in which we expect people to practice law as a collective, especially during a time of challenge. If you misapply your personal obligations to collective situations, you paskin wrong. So he wants to understand what is a klal mitzvah here of the individual's duty to collective communal responsibilities. So far, that's the introduction. And we now leap into mitzvot tzedakah. So he says, I want to now talk about the mitzvot tzedakah. And just before we learn the text, I'll give you also an introduction. There's a mitzvah of tzedakah that each one of us has. It's a mitzvah of giving tzedakah, and that tzedakah is obliged. We talk about maaser, or giving up to a tenth of one's available income in order to give charity. And above and beyond that, there's a giving of tzedakah to people in need who may well come up to us and say that they're in need. Alongside this, there are community tzedakah initiatives, or community tzedakah obligations. So, for example, I may not be able to support every person in my neighborhood who is in need, and I shouldn't be expected to do so, but my community is. And so the rules of tzedakah of the community are different to the rules of tzedakah of an individual. An individual, it's measured based on what they have, and then they need to do things with what they have. And in terms of community, it's based on what the needs are, and they need to up their game to fulfill the needs of their community. Now, there is a Gemara in Masechet Ketubot that talks about a concept mentioned originally in Parashat Re'eh of Dei Machzaro Asher Yechsar Lo. You should give the poor person what they need. And the Gemara goes on to say that means if a person was previously rich and then they became poor and they're used to a certain lifestyle, then actually we're supposed to help them maintain that lifestyle. So if a person, for example, lives in a mansion and then they fall on tough times, we may well say, well, they should move into a smaller property. Actually, the mitzvah of Dei Machzor is to help them maintain living there, because losing that status can itself be just as painful as being broke itself. Now, the dinim of Dei Machzor are already discussed, even though it's a pasuk in the Torah and it's a Gemara in Masechet Ketubot, and it's a din in Shulchan Aruch. What Rav Asher Weiss wants to discuss here is, where does it fall vis-a-vis the obligations of Yachid versus Tzibur? So he quotes here from the Shulchan Aruch, right? And he says, how much do we give to a poor person? Dei Machzor Asher Yechsar Lo. Give them what they're lacking, whatever they're lacking, give them. Ketzad, how does that work? If that person is hungry, you feed them. They need clothes, you cover them. If they don't have utensils in the house, get that for them. If when that person was rich, they had a horse that pulled their carriage, right, or they had a slave that pulled them, then Dei Machzor demands this. We could have a whole diyun about this. We're not going to. We're interested in the cloud. If they need bread, you give them bread. Isa, not nima isa, right? Mita, not nima mita. If you need to give them dough, give them dough. If you give them bed, if they need a bed, give them bed. They're used to having warm bread, give them warm bread. So on, and cold bread, etc., etc. We don't need to get into all the details, but there's a bit in bold on the Shulchan Aruch that Rav Asher Weiss wishes to bring our attention to. However, all this is the demand on the Gaba Tzedakah, meaning the person overseeing community charity distribution, or Abim B'yachad, or a group of Jews, even if they don't have a Gaba Tzedakah. But But this principle of giving a poor person what they need, that's not a din on the yachid, on the individual. Instead, it's a din on the community. If a person is poor, they let the community know what they need. If the community provides, wonderful. If not, the individual gives what they can, even if there's a big gap between what the individual gives to the poor person and what the poor person would ideally need. Again, I don't want to get into the thicket of the dinim of Dei Machzera, because here Rav Asher Weiss is trying to teach us a principle. There's tvei dinim, there's two rules of the din of tzedakah. One is when a person gives as an individual. The other is other tzedakah duties of a community. And he makes it clear that this din of Dei Machzera applies to a community. And an individual isn't expected to be able to be as generous and to provide in the way in which a community is supposed to do so. Why is this relevant? It's incredibly relevant because it helps us understand a little bit of the principle of Chovat HaYachid Mitzvat HaTzibur. If there's a mitzvah of the tzibur, does a private person need to take on the obligations of that tzibur? The answer is no. That private person needs to fulfill what they need to fulfill. And it may well be that there's a gap between what they can do and what is asked of, what is expected of the community. And that means for every mitzvah, you need to kind of ask yourself, is this a mitzvah on me alone, or is this a mitzvah on the community? He quotes Rama, Ramosha Isserles, who emphasizes this, but the Rama makes it clear, but the individual only needs to give what they can give. He says others disagreed. Rav Yosef Sarkis, Rav Vilna Gaon, and took a different view based on a story of Hillel in the Gemara. But as he says, we can't really learn lessons from Hillel because Hillel always went above and beyond. He's not an example of what we must do. He's an example of doing beautiful things. At the end, therefore, at the end of this section, Rav Asher Weiss makes it very clear. A mitzvah that falls on a community, a singular person, individual, is only obliged to give their part. They're not obliged to take on the duties of everybody. An individual isn't a community, an individual is part of a community. So community mitzvahs need to be responded to by the community. Community mitzvahs do not need to be taken on by individuals as if they can carry that vast load. I'm going to pause here for a second. We've done section 1. So you can see what Rav Asher Weiss is doing is collating data. He's really being like a detective. He's trying to collect evidence to answer this question of what are the duties of an individual for mitzvahs of the community. And he said from the laws of Dei Machzera, we learn from the laws of tzedakah that there is laws of the individual, laws of a community, and one does not need to carry the load of the other. I'm going to pause for any questions. Questions only on these points because I want to avoid confusion. It's confusing itself enough.
Rav Johnny, I'm a little confused because bottom line, whether you're talking about the individual or the collective, you're talking about prioritization of resources that are going to be finite, meaning the community can't give more than it has, which is the sum of what the individuals have given.
Yes, but so I'm going to say that's an important point, but actually less relevant, at least for this particular issue. There's a whole question without basically the halacha discusses how do we deal with resources, etc. His point is to do with obligation, not necessarily about the extent to which we can meet that obligation. If a community, meaning there are mitzvahs that fall in different locations, shall we say. One is the location of my daled amos, as an individual's obligation. And there are mitzvahs that fall in obligation of the daled amos, shall we say, of the community, call it, say, the community center, whatever, the representation of the kehillah. And yes, of course, in order for the kehillah to fulfill that, individuals must contribute. That's a given, and they should, and where possible, the community can therefore fulfill its obligation. However, the key question he's asking is, must I as an individual feel an obligation to take on those responsibilities of the community, for example, when the community isn't doing its job? For example, when there are some people in the community aren't stepping up to the plate. To what extent should I be going out of my daladamas? To what extent should I be giving above and beyond what I have in order to fulfill this duty of a community because there's a person in need? And Rav Asher Weiss's answer is, you do you, community does it, you're part of a community, but there can be many situations where the community isn't doing its job, and no, you do not need to step up to try and fill that gap. That's unreasonable to expect a yachid to do a mitzvah of the tzibur, right? Whether it's $1 difference or $5 or 5 million, meaning the amounts are important, but the principle here is critical. I don't have to step up for community things above and beyond. I'll give you a very, very simple practical example. We're going to see many more. I live in the south of Israel, right? So right now we have a yeshuv where we've got 24-hour guards. Now, that's not the army, that the army's fighting literally on our border. So these are civilians. So I'm going to be doing guard duty later on. Now, should I say, well, since people are busy, I'll do guard duty the whole time? No, guard duty is a duty of a community. I need to do my bit. Now, what happens if there's a gap? Well, the truth is, if there's a gap, everyone needs to be told, get off your backside and help more. By the way, there isn't, because everyone's amazing. But fundamentally, I shouldn't feel an obligation to be doing guard duty 24 hours a day, because that's an individual take-home responsibility of a tzibur. Might it be, though, that there's a gap between the amount of individuals and the duties? Yes. In a case of war, we basically say, really, everybody needs to help a little bit more. But in the case of tzedakah, and I've only got $100 in my wallet and I've given it, I shouldn't need to go into debt because other people aren't giving. And that's the key point. And if it means that the poor person doesn't get the ani lilkov lefanav v'sus lilkov lefanav, so be it. Then our resources don't meet the criteria of fulfilling that mitzvah in full. So Adkan, that's the principle from this klal, because we're going to make, the whole point is, what he does from every section is, he adds layers and layers of argument, right? So far we've seen one glimpse of one argument from one Erev Halacha. He then says, let's look at different Erev Halacha. And one of the reasons I want us to learn this Sefer is because in every chapter, we can get through a tremendous amount of material, which has been carefully collated, beautifully presented, and then compellingly argued. So he says, let's talk about the mitzvah of Erevei Chatzerot. That means building an Erev around a certain local neighborhood. הנה כתב חסם סייף בשעת תשובס, דחובה מוטלת על רב של כל קהילה ועל תלמידי חכמים שבא לתקן ערב חצרות בצורת הפתח כדי להציל את העם מחילול שבת. According to Chasam Seifa, every Rav in every city needs to make sure that there's an Erev within a city. I'm not talking about, well, we can debate how big the Erev should be, and obviously, as we well know, some Eruvin are much more trickier than others halachically. What he says is, in a kind of village or town that one is in, the duty of the Rav and other Talmidei Chachamim, their duty is to make an Eruv. But the point that Rav Asher Weiss is going to say is, when we say it's their duty, do we mean their individual duty, or there's a community duty which we expect them to be driving forward? My nafkamina, the nafkamina would be, what happens if they don't? And he quotes exactly this situation. Now, we're now about to quote the Gemara in Eruvin, which is in Aramaic. What I did for us is I prepared, let me just see if I can find it here. I prepared a handout with the two Gemarot that are quoted in this chapter, which are in pure Aramaic with a translation. So can everyone see this here? Yeah? Yofi. So I'm going to read this here, both in Aramaic and English for those to follow. Amalei Rabba Barav Hanan Labaya. So we have Rabba Barav Hanan says to Abaya, in an alleyway that contains two great people such as Rabba and Abaya, they'd just be mentioning it. Could it be, how could it be that there's no Erev? How can it be that there's no merging of alleyways to create some kind of collective space. Mainly, how can it be that there's a place where these two great rabbis are living and they haven't made an Eruv? Right? That's the question. What are we going to do? Right? Rabbi, it's not appropriate for him to have to build an Eruv. I have to read them Begilsan, and I'm learning Torah, right? And then we say, right? And the rest of the people, they're not involved in such things, meaning the community aren't interested in doing it. Rava's not capable of doing it, and I'm learning. Right? And if we're to transfer the residents to share the bread in my basket, and they would help out financially, right? Then that would be itself tricky. It doesn't really matter what the answer is. It's not so relevant to our discussion. The key point being mentioned here is we have a situation where we're told by the Khatam Sofer the Rabbanim are expected to make an Eruv, and the Gemara talks about a situation where two great Rabbanim are living in a neighborhood and no Eruv is made, where one, it's not becoming for him to make it, and the other one, the person's learning. Ask Rav Asher Weiss, the Tim Taloma to end call mitzvah taken Eruv echatzev shtuin v'ot tzach mia masha Tama Rabba Rab Chanan she'ein Eruv my boy shebo garim ha'abaya. Basically, this Gemara needs some explanation. Either we say there's no obligation for them to build an Eruv, so why giving these rabbis a hard time? And if there is, surely they should be doing it. So the way Rav Asher Weiss reads this Gemara, if it's really the obligation of Rava, how can he say it's beneath his dignity to build an Eruv? And how can Abaya say he's not able to because he's learning? And so Rav Asher Weiss's interpretation of this Gemara, the details of the Gemara are interesting, but more so in order to understand his conclusion. Al kochach the kiven she'ein zu mitzvah she'ale yachid el mitzvah mutalat ad tzibur ein ze chava gmora v'shayim hu yishtamet mitzvah zu mehanitam. Because it's a mitzvah that actually falls on a community, which generally the rabbis drive, but it requires the investment of the rest of the community. If the rest of the community are not invested in it, then the rabbis can say individually, it's not my mitzvah, it's all of our mitzvahs. And if you guys aren't doing your job, I shouldn't be expected to carry the yoke of this mitzvah for the entire community. Meaning, what we have here is an important klal. When we often say it's a duty of a rabbi of a community to do X, we need to ask the question, is it his individual duty? Or is it the duty of the community and we ask the rabbi to be spearheading it? Well, if it's the latter and the rest of the community are not involved or not interested in being involved, then the Rav is not obliged because we don't expect an individual to carry the obligations of a community. And sometimes that will mean, such as this, that an outcome isn't done because there's a gap between the capabilities and energies and availabilities of an individual versus the needs that are required to figure out and deliver the outcome which is obliged of the community. So this too is another example where we learn that an individual has different obligations to a community, and an individual does not need to push themselves to carry the yoke of a community. So far, that's case number 2. You'll remember we began with a question of to what extent should a male have to go out of their way to fulfill a mitzvah of doing a brit milah for a child, right? And it's not quite clear. Should they have to travel very far? Should they have to lose other income? Or should they at the very least have to put themselves under great duress, be away from their family for a Shabbos to do this? That doesn't mean if they do it, is it a nice thing? Is it a good thing? It is. It's wonderful. But here we're interested about obligations because all of us are often tugged in different directions. Right now, I can't speak for you, but I've been tugged in a billion directions for the past week. And you have to kind of ask yourself, what's my obligation? What's a nice thing to do? And where should I begin, right? My obligation and nice things to do often can be in conflict with one another. To know what is your chovah, what is your obligation, is surely an important thing. We saw in the Gemara relating to be mataken eruvin that A Rav can say, it's not my private obligation, it's our obligation. If you guys aren't going to do something, I'm not going to do something either. And I have this in my community where I'm a kind of a Rav of a shul, but at the same time, it's not a formal role, or it's a formal unpaid role. So sometimes there are things I know that need to be done. But at the same time, I can't just be doing it myself. And I say, listen, guys, you want it? Let's do it together. If not, you can't expect me to step up the whole time. Yes, gvul. Yes, gvul. But understanding how that comes about, where that comes about, it is based on essays such as this. So let's just go through the din of milah. We're not going to, by the way, we're going to probably have to skip one or two of these chapters for reasons of time, but I want us to have clarity about the argument Rav Asher Weiss is making. And he says, the Gemara in Kiddushin says, there's an important din in Hilchos Bris Milah. According to technical halacha, I'm well aware, of course, we're not going to ignore the fact that already in the Torah, we see a woman giving Bris Milah to her sons. But still, in terms of din, it's an obligation of a father to make sure that his son or sons have a Brit Milah. And if the father fails to fulfill that obligation or is unable to, then the Beis Din has an obligation to carry that out. Okay, just be aware of that. It's on the father, but if he can't do it, then it falls on the Beis Din. Of course, it'd be wonderful that other relatives can then be agents to enable that mitzvah to carry out that mitzvah. But this is a technical principle. When we talk about Beis Din, we mean a representative of the entire Jewish people. And this is already mentioned by other Rishonim. So we have a mitzvah which is obliged of an individual, the father, but if the father is out the picture, it's an obligation of the community. So Brit Milah, in an absent father situation, is a mitzvah on the tzibur. Omnam kozev mishel omalu aviv. Al kol od sheyesh lo ben av chafet lekei mitzvato en kol chiyuv al Beis Din el al avi aben bilvad. All the while the father is in a picture, he's around, he's alive, etc., then that his obligation alone. But again, once he isn't, for whatever reason there could be, then the mitzvah transitions to a kila. Now comes Rav Asher Weiss, and he quotes from the Tshuvas of Rav Yitzchak Weiss, the Minchas Yitzchak, and he says, "V'shas Tshuvas Minchas Yitzchak nishal ha'im tzorich hamar litroach tirchei yateru lotzi ha'hotza'ot k'gon la'azov beito l'tarech b'yom acheret b'Shabbat k'dei lekayem et mutal alav mitzvah neskavah zu la'achnis yadei yisrael b'bito shel Avraham Avinu." He basically says the question that I originally began, should a male go out of his way and put themselves under great duress in order to fulfill a mitzvah of enabling a child to have a Brit Milah? That question was previously asked of Rav Weiss. According to the Minchas Yitzchak, yes, a male has to be matriach himself. He has to travel far, even if it means not being at home for Rosh Hashanah for 2 days. If he has a duty to do a bris milah for this child, then he should do so. That's a psak of the Minchas Yitzchak, and I want to demonstrate to you how Rav Asher Weiss, though he's a wonderful and gentle person, when it comes to halacha, he's very insistent. He says, "Atama ani amash lo yevin klal bein mitzvah matelas al kol yachid v'yachid mitzvah she'ena mitzvah degufei el chavas etzibur." And he says, basically, I'm going to paraphrase, I am completely startled how the Minchas Yitzchak can be so confused as to conflate the duties of an individual with the duties of the tzibur. Right? Yes, an individual needs to go out of its way, but an individual who isn't the primary obligation fulfiller does not need to go out of their way as if they are a community, because they are just one member of a community. When it comes to a mitzvah, the community, namely a Brit Milah, in an instance where a father is not in the picture, the individual does not need to spend a lot of money or put in a lot of investment or certainly be away from their family for Rosh Hashanah. They got to do whatever they can do, right, alongside all the other contributions of the rest of Kehillah. So if, for example, there's a child in your community who hasn't had a Brit Milah, and there's a male, right? And in order to fulfill this Brit Milah, he has to travel very, very far. The rest of the community need to support him doing so. If they don't, then he doesn't need to invest that time and effort going fulfilling that mitzvah, because he's, as an individual, taken responsibility of Kila. And according to Rav Asher Weiss, the din, the klal of mitzvahs is you do not need to do that. That's not your obligation. It's the obligation of the Kila to step up. Now, might that mean that there's a casualty, shall we say, that this child does not have a Brit Milah because the community didn't step up? Yes. But whose fault it is? The community. It's the people whom the obligation falls. You can't blame the male if the rest of the people in the community don't give some dollars or shekels and don't enable this person to travel in a way which doesn't cost them significantly, or don't find a way which reduce that effort. You can't expect one person to carry the load of a community when ultimately that's not their obligation. So Rav Asher Weiss is very clear. I disagree with the Minchat Asher, sadly, but he says this is an example of confused halacha, where a person who hasn't thought through about the klalei mitzvahs reaches an incorrect conclusion. And I just want to, before I proceed, as I mentioned before, too many people, when they speak about halacha, especially those who are lacking shimush, this is a kind of a textbook example of an error, of a bad error, by the way. It's halacha which he thinks is wrong. It's where a person thinks about the greatness of a mitzvah, and they say, since it's a great mitzvah, therefore, if you have an obligation, you should do it. Rav Asher Weiss says it's maybe a wonderful mitzvah, it's a tremendous mitzvah, but it's not your mitzvah that you have to go out of your way to do it. It's your mitzvah that if you can do it within the reasonable amount of effort, you for sure should do that. But that extra investment on your own kind of checkbook, right, doesn't need to fall on you. And if it does fall on you, you don't have to support that. That's not on you. So it's an important klal which has tremendous ramifications in this situation, in the time of Milchama, has tremendous ramifications in many other things. Does this mean that, God forbid, that we'd be a more stingy community? No. Because again, I've spoken to people this week who, because of the confusion on this din, they've taken on more than they can chew, and they're crumbling based on what they think is expected of them at this time. It's because we're not clear about the klalei mitzvahs. We're not clear that there are distinctions between yachid and tzibah. And unless we are, people sometimes act as if they are able to respond as a whole community, even though they're just one person, and that's a recipe for disaster. Now, before we go on, any, again, immediate questions primarily on what we've discussed. There's always a what ifs. What ifs are interesting, but they'll distract us. Anybody? Okay, let's now revert back to the second handout, because there was a second source we need to be looking at, which is two Mishnayos from Masechet Shkalim. I'm now going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see that now. And you can see, just to be able to write this essay, by the way, just know what it means to be a Gaon. Be able to write this essay, he's jumping from one halach and Shulchan Aruch, Gemara's here, Mishnayos there, and careful readings, close readings of texts, try and make a halachic argument. And the halachic argument has tremendous consequences. To paskin without having reasoning is to generate incorrect rulings. And what this book does, although all his tshuvas do, but all this book does with greater care, is demonstrate the reasoning of halachic thinking. Now, here's an interesting Mishnah which leads him to have a lengthy discussion. We're not going to spend as much time as he does because we have more limited time, but still it's an important source for the argument that he's making. We are told, if an animal that is fit for the Mizbeach was found straying from Yerushalayim as far as Migdal Eder. And similarly, if he was found within the distance any other direction, what are we told? Meaning in any other direction, it says, males are supposed to be for burnt offerings, and females are for peace offerings. Let's just explain. If an animal is found within a certain radius of Yerushalayim at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, we assume that that animal was meant to be dedicated to be brought in the Mizbeach, he ran away or whatever, and thereby we assume that it should be brought as a korban. And we're saying if it's a male offering, it's a male animal, it'll be for a burnt offering, for an olah, and if it's a female, it'll be for a peace offering, for zivchei shlamim. And if you see an animal not too long before a Pesach, then we've got to assume that the animal's there for the Korban Pesach. Again, all of these sources we could discuss for extensive amounts of time. But then we're told the following. Originally, the court would seize collateral for the one who found such an animal until they would bring all the additional bits and bobs, the libations and the meal offerings that would accompany a korban. Meaning, if I found an animal and I brought it to the temple, and apparently when you bring the animal, you're supposed to bring all these other things, then I'm going to penalize you to make sure you bring these other things. But unfortunately, what that then did meant that when people found animals, they just brought them literally to the gates of the temple and ran away. They said, I don't want that to happen. The Mishnah therefore says, when this happened, the Bet Din made a decision that the additional supplementary things, the wine libations, the water, and the meal offerings, they'll be provided by the tzibur. So if I find an animal, I'll bring it, and all the extra things will be provided by the tzibur, by the public funds given to the Beis HaMikdash. Now, why does this source interest Rav Asher Weiss? The answer is because it has a very, very clear distinction about the obligations of an individual and the obligations of a community. So he begins here by quoting this Mishnah, and he says, he says, first and foremost, what is this all about? I found an animal, it wasn't mine. I bring it because I'm a good person. Now you're putting on me an obligation as if this was my animal that I consecrated to the temple. Said, surely it shouldn't have been that we initially penalize that person that they have to bring these extra libations and these extra meal offerings. Instead, automatically, this should have been an obligation of the tzibur. He says, now, in order to answer this, he then quotes a tshuva of Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. Just think about how he's making an argument here. There's somebody was nitgalu kivotem shel Yisrael samoch le'ir Koln b'Germania. Imagine I'm doing some digging in Germany, and I stumble across some old graves of Jews. Yeah. And in order to excavate those graves and make sure they have a proper burial, I seemingly have to spend money. Yeah. שכשם שכל המוצא בהמה מחויב להביא נסכים בביתו, כיוון שמצווה זו נתקלה לידו ונזדמנה לו, כך חובה על קבורת המת, וכבודו הוא עובר על הקהילה הזו. Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld derived from this Mishnah that just as much as if an individual finds a korban walking around, they need to bring it, and they need to themselves supplement it with those other things, even though they themselves were not the original person who dedicated that animal for Mizbeach. So too, if you come across a mitzvah which requires additional investment, then you basically have this obligation. And continues Rav Asher Weiss, and he says, he says that seems to go against the klal that I think we've identified in our previous arguments. And now this leads him to a much more delicate and nuanced reading of this whole Mishnah, which I'd love to do, but I'm cautious of not getting too stuck into. So I'm just going to leap over to where it says Vanira. It says He says, I think this Mishnah in Masechet Shkalim is different to the sources we've seen until now. כל מצוות צדקה, תיקון עירובין, אף מילת התינוק שאין לו אב. Previously, we've talked about mitzvahs that apply to a community. To what extent should an individual fulfill them? After Mila min haTorah, mitzvah zu mutelet al kol Yisrael. Mikol makom mitzvim b'nei ha'ir lidog l'chol tzarchei Yisrael. And then talks about mitzvah. However, אבל בבהמה שנמצאת בין ירושלים למגדל עדר, אין זה עניין לבני העיר, ואין מוצאים למי לדחות ומי לתלות. על כוח אמרו חכמים, מצווה באה לידך תח מצנה. In this case, this animal's walking around, and basically almost finders keepers. And so initially, by finding the animal, it wasn't a community obligation. It's randomly walking around. So I find it, and the obligation initially falls on me. However, the rabbis realized, no, that's to put too much of a burden on an individual, and instead they shared that load onto a tzibur. And as a result of this, this source actually comes not to be in conflict with, but instead be in alignment with all the other sources we've seen beforehand. The where it's an individual, then that obligation needs to be fulfilled by that individual. But where it's a community, then they need to step up and do so. So far, that's the discussion about the korbanos. Again, there's more details, fascinating, wonderful, but for reasons of time, we're going to leap on. I do want to mention just a couple of sections of this section, a couple of sections of this subsection, because they're so important and sadly very, very, very relevant. Now, there's a mitzvah called mace mitzvah. That is, if a person finds, God forbid, a body, and unfortunately we've seen this just within days, a person finds a body and there's nowhere else to take care of them, then you yourself need to bury them. It's a din from the Torah called met mitzvah. A met mitzvah is such a severe mitzvah that it means that even if that person's a Kohen who technically shouldn't be in contact with the dead, they still fulfill it. Because a met mitzvah, if you're the one who found that person, then you're the one who needs to deal with it. הנה נחלקו גדולי האחרונים במית מצווה שכל מצבים להתעסק בכבודו, אפילו כהנים מטמאים למית מצווה. המצווה זו מוטלת רק על מי שראה המת מוטל בשדה, or כל מי ששמע. Now the question is asked here, does that apply to all people who find the body? What happens if you just hear about it? You may say, well, who cares? Well, he's going to give you a couple of practical situations which have been discussed by previous poskim and which he himself had to address. I was asked this question years ago. A person living in a Yenevelt community in some faraway place in the States. They heard about this widowed Jew who's died in a hospital somewhere. They had no other relative. And they were scared that that person is going to be put through fire, be burnt. Rav Kohenaya, and this rabbi was a Kohen. לדבריו, אם לא היה מתעסק בעצמו, לא היה מי שיתעסק בכבוד המת. ושאל אם מותר לו להתעסק במת, זה שהוציא מבית חולים לטמא בו. So the question here is, in terms of a further mitzvah, to what extent should this individual feel obliged to travel far and save this Jew, especially if this person's a Kohen? Now, if this Kohen would have found this body, it makes mitzvah, he has to do it. But here he's heard about this story. How much should this rabbi have to travel and deal with a situation far away, which also involves him being matame, right? He says, I was asked a question of Rav Tzva'i, who was a Kohen, who was asked to unfortunately deal with a situation where there was a terrible accident, and according to the rules of the army, the Rav of that Yechidah has to deal with any matters of burial and death of the troops. או שמא עליו להשתדל לבקש מרב צבאי שיבוא ממקום אחר, כעבור כמה שעות להתעסק בכבוד המת, משני תמיד תסתפק, אם מותר לו לטמא עצמו. So here he's asking, is hearing about a situation different to seeing it? שמא אין המצווה מוטל עליו כל זמן שלא ראו. Maybe the mitzvah isn't on him if the news is just something he's heard rather than physically being there. Maybe other people can deal with this a couple of hours later. So in this Rav Tzva'i case, he could either go right now or a couple of hours later, other people could come. So this is a more nuanced question. To what extent is an individual duty bound to do a mitzvah, which they hear about, but they're not necessarily in that moment? And how much are they duty bound to do it when other people could come into the picture a little bit later on? Says Rav Asher Weiss, mitzvah, mitzvah applies even if you just hear about the person, even if you haven't seen them. If you're not dealing with it, unfortunately, other people less capable will do so. Don't delay. If it'd only be a couple of minutes, the other person would come fine, he says. But any much more than that, you have to deal with it. And then he can discuss his, sadly, again, Jews who are murdered, and to what extent, for example, must we deal with kvura on a yontif? Now, you may well say again, we're getting to the thicket of dinim, ritual dinim, rather than general klal of yachid versus tzibur. But part and parcel of these questions is this obligation of an individual? Is this an obligation of the klal? However, I am going to skip this, notwithstanding how painful and how important it is, because I want us to reach this chapter, wants to reach an important klal. And this is a very practical question, which some of you may have experienced. If you live in an apartment building where other Jews live, and let's say the front door needs a mezuzah. So ordinarily we'd say everybody in the apartment building should donate money, and they buy the mezuzah for the front door or for whatever other public doorways that exist. And similarly, he says also in terms of marker, in terms of building a parapet, you got a flat roof, or b'dikas chametz, checking for chametz in the building. What happens though if some of the residents of the building are not interested, right? What happens if 50% of the building aren't interested in buying mezuzah, shmuzuzah, whatever? To what extent are you individually obliged to make sure that your building has a mezuzah? Which is, in many ways, is to bring us to the nuts and bolts of this question. How much should the individual carry the load of the community? He says, it's obvious if all the other residents of the building are Jews, and they're all obliged. It's a tzibah. Right? These mitzvahs fall on the shoulders of all of them. Everyone needs to put in the effort, both in terms monetarily and also in terms of physical effort. By the way, I want to make this clear. What comes out of this, which is fairly, very obvious, but too often it doesn't happen this way. If, for example, you're a member of a shul, and the community is expected to tidy up all the chairs after Kiddush, that means the community is expected, not 3 or 4 people. And if 3 or 4 people feel an obligation that they need to do it and the rest of the community walks away, those 3 and 4 people do not need to do more than their fair share. They can leave the rest of the chairs. Not because they're cruel people, but because they're only expected to do what their share is. It shouldn't be too many times it happens in shuls and communities. The handful of people carry the load of the community. The din is a very simple thing. If it's a mitzvah on you individually, you do it. If it's a mitzvah on the community, on the klal, then the klal has to help financially and in terms of effort. And if they don't, and if there is a gap, what we're learning here in this perek is, so be it. But the individual is not obligated to step up and fill that gap. He asks here though, what happens if some of the building are non-Jews or some are not religious Jews? And they're not interested in participating in the mitzvah. Has this, is a soul from Jew or the handful of from Jews in that building obliged to take on this obligation to buy the mezuzah and get them put up, or build a parapet, or whatever it is? Ultimately, this question is based on our query. Is a collective mitzvah falling on the shoulders of individuals or not? אז ברת האוזן, מצינו מעין שתי הגדרות במצוות מוטלות על הציבור. He says, in actual fact, when you actually think about the mitzvahs of a tzibur, there's two categories. מחד גיסא, יש מצוות מוטלות על הציבור משותף, או ליחידים כלל. There are two types of tzibur mitzvahs. One which doesn't ever fall on the individuals, just falls on the community. Kind of give a mitzvah shenitzav Israel b'knisas haaretz. For example, the mitzvahs that fell on the Jewish people when they came into the land of Israel. Right, to establish a king, to wipe out Amalek, which we're doing right now, and livnot bet b'chira, and to build a temple. Those mitzvahs they don't fall on an individual, they fall on the people. No people, no mitzvah. The people, a mitzvah. But there's no place of the individual in that puzzle. It's a tzibah only mitzvah, to which obviously everyone needs to participate. Mitzvot ele me'etzem tiv'a mitzvot ha'tzibohen. Me'idach, alongside this, matzinu b'milat haben she'im lo malo aviv matzavim kol Yisrael amol. For example, in the case of bris milah, if the father doesn't give the bris milah to their son, then the Yisrael, the community, is obliged to make sure he gets circumcised. Or, for example, if people haven't done, if the sheikh doesn't know mitzvah kisvei adam, so mitzvah al kol Yisrael, then the mitzvah falls on all of the Jewish people. In this instance, every individual person has some measure of obligation. However, that measure of obligation obviously depends on their abilities and their resources. He says, in this case, I think the case of mezuzah is more like the second category. The mitzvahs here of mezuzah and bdikas chametz and doing a market are the kind of mitzvahs applying to individuals. And here in this instance, in this context, it's applied to a collective. No individual is obliged to fill the mitzvahs in full, but every person has to contribute. Now, of course, so what happens if they don't? Now, he gives a whole bunch of sources, which I'm skipping, not because they're not interesting, they're fascinating. This is my bread and butter, but I'm skipping them because I'm conscious of time and I want us to conclude and summarize. So he basically says the following: I think that in a situation when you got a number of neighbors and they're living with shutaf, they're living in a shared building, should an individual put on a mezuzah? And he says a very practical thing. If we're talking about one mezuzah on the front door, then yeah, you know what? That's within the reach of a person. It's a bit of a tircha. It's asking them to go a little bit more out of their way, but yes. But if we're talking about mezuzahs for all the other doors, then no. Meaning, there sometimes comes where a group of people are obliged to do something and they don't do so for one reason or another. Should an individual step up? We so far said no, no, and no. He says here, when the act is relatively small and the cost is relatively low, and it's within that person's capabilities, then yes. But that does not mean that that person should feel a tremendous financial burden. So if we're talking about one mezuzah, okay, so they should. It's the right thing to do. But we're talking about multiple, they shouldn't. Because that's not their job. That's not their duty. That's not on them. Now he brings other proofs here that are never, but fundamentally that's almost, shall we say, the punchline which he began early on at the end of the first section, and he reiterated and sharpened and clarified and crystallized in all the later sections. So what we have here to summarize is an essay asking, to what extent is an individual obliged in the mitzvahs of the collective? We've clarified that there are two types of collective mitzvahs. We've said certain mitzvahs are individual, certain mitzvahs of the collective of one brand, certain of the other. And he's made it clear from a whole number of rayot, of proofs, that an individual is not obliged to fulfill the mitzvah of a community. And that may well lead to a result that what you can do is less than what ideally should be done. But okay, that may be the case. We need to recognize that if a group is obligated to do something, their job is to do that. And it would be wrong for communities to expect anything more of individuals. And too often, as I say, I see people who carry greater burdens than they can or they should. And too often I see communities who expect too much of individuals. And it's wrong. It's pashut wrong. Even more so in our situation right now, where people are running around packing food, making meals, doing just chesed here, there, and everywhere is just abundant and remarkable. But every person needs to know they have duties for themselves, that being part of a community, they need to contribute. But they aren't the tzibah. They aren't Klal Yisrael Kula. They're a yachid. And there are consequences of that, the tov v'lo, both for good and for bad. And we need to educate Jewish society. We need to educate ourselves that sometimes to demand too much of people is to burn them out. And Rav Osher Weiss made it clear. He said, I think the Minchat Asher is wrong. And he said in a couple of other sources, which we skipped over, he said, I think this person's read it wrong. Again, he doesn't say that. It's not about trying to win points. It's about understanding a principle. And because this principle matters. Because when people are shilas, you need to understand the context, the landscape, the framework, the principles which underpin that shilah. And if you don't understand this difference between Yachid and Tzibah, then you will demand too much of some people and they will give off too much of themselves, which can have devastating effects monetarily, in terms of stress, in terms of mental health, in terms of physical health, right? In terms of shalom bayit. How many homes do we know where people are out of the house more because they're at this meeting and that meeting and that meeting, this meeting, because nobody else is stepping up? So don't. It's not because you shouldn't care, but it's not your obligation. If you're leaving kids at home and they're paying the price for you feeling the obligation to take on more than you should, then you've misunderstood the balance. And leading a healthy, balanced life is part of what it means to be a Jew, especially in times such as these, where people feel that yoke of obligation and they feel a guilt of not doing more and more and more. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not ask us to do everything. HaKadosh Baruch Hu asked us to do what we should be doing. And this essay is a masterful essay, which goes through so many different areas of halacha to make a point, a nuanced point, but an important one, which is know that there's a difference. And do your bit absolutely. And tell your neighbor to do their bit and the person living in the same building to do their bit. And that's how great things are done. We're seeing great things being done right now. But if we don't train people, we don't educate people to do their bit, and if we feel a sense of guilt, an excess obligation to do more than we can, then we create unhealthy, unbalanced communities. And too many Jewish communities are like that for all the different reasons. And so, again, in the ideal world, we'd have started with Perek Aleph and gone through a much longer piece about different things. But especially since we're on Zoom and it's a slightly different way of delivery, I felt we should start with this, not only because it's a little bit of a short essay. Know that some essays are shorter than this and some are longer. And obviously, sometimes we'll have to skip. Sometimes we'll have to cover the whole thing. But hopefully through this class, you've got a sense of what is the Sefer about. It's about a giant of halacha in our midst who has thought with such depth about matters of nuance. And in so doing, he's putting ideas into focus that until now we didn't realize were blurry. No end, and now happy to take any questions. He delivered these shiurim on Shabbos afternoons over a period of a year or so. The Sefer is dedicated on his wife. And I remember I went to one of those shiurim in his yeshiva in Ramot, and I went with a friend, and the room was full, and a lot of people fairly learned sitting there. And he said, I want to discuss a certain klal mitzvah. I think it was mitzvah tzrichas kavana. And there's a principle which most people have covered if they've studied enough Gemara, enough halacha, and they think they know. And what he does is, within a few minutes, make you realize you don't know. because most of us don't think with such depth. Most of us don't go through Kol Torah Kula that helps us filter and make sense of these klalim in a way which is helpful. Once you do that, though, this kind of clarity which he presents, which Rav Asher Weiss does better than almost anybody in our generation, this clarity helps Paskin. This clarity helps each of us make decisions, and it helps each of us live a life which is committed to halacha, committed to being Avdei Hashem. So hopefully you realize that, yes, it's a heavy sefer, it's a serious sefer. I'm not holding back punches, but nevertheless, it's one which I think teaches us so much and also helps us understand how to live, how to make decisions, and what to do. So I hope that was of use. Obviously, if you have any questions, feel free to ask now. If you want to ask afterwards, you know how to contact me, WhatsApp, email, whatever.
May I ask a question? May I offer something?
Sure.
Okay, so the opposite is also true. I read yesterday that a donor to a very enormous billionaire Jewish donor to Harvard said no more because of that letter. So removing yourself from offering when you know you must is also true.
100%. I think it's an important, really, really important point. Knowing your obligations and your loyalties means you need to know who you're hanging around. You need to extract yourself sometimes from not just toxic relationships, sometimes even vicious relationships. And we've seen in the past few days some viciousness in the streets around the world. And I live in the south of Israel, and there are, fighter jets flying ahead of me. My house shakes when there are missiles, and I know no safer place than this. And I say this with absolute certainty. I've been asked by numerous people, do you want to go somewhere? I have an apartment I can go to. In the sense like, he said, are you crazy? Are you crazy? I have my brothers and sisters who are fighting for our people. I have my friends who stand in guard, right? We have Am Yisrael giving unbelievable amounts of goodness. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. And my kids, even if I wanted to, my kids would say, have told me very clearly, we're going nowhere. This is home. But notwithstanding all of that, I know also, because of the work that I do, and I've spoken to a number of people, people already have anxieties, people already take on too many things, are taking on more things. And it's not good for them, it's not healthy for them. And if that's you, or those are people that you know, you need to tell them enough. You need to tell them that in actual fact, the mitzvahs of the Yachid, there's mitzvahs of Tzibah, and you're not a Tzibah, especially if you've got kids in the army, and you've got doing other things, and you're trying to solve everything and go to every shiva and do all these kind of things. You can't do it. Can't do it. You shouldn't do it. Enough. You need to know what your limits are, and you need to not go above and beyond it, because it doesn't help people. And that's not just my opinion, that's halacha. Halacha. And once we understand that that's what these Gemaras say, what the Shulchan Aruch says, once we understand this, what one of our great poskim say, it gives us even greater confidence to sometimes say, I can't do anymore. I've done what I can, right? And I've done my mitzvah and then some. But I also have other obligations to my family, other obligations to my health. And I can't be a shmata for everybody else who isn't doing what they're supposed to, because self-welfare is also important. Looking after yourself, a chai b'hem, right? So this is I think a powerful essay. I chose it over Shabbos because I thought it would speak to you. It certainly spoke to me as I prepared it. I hope we've enjoyed learning together. Again, there's lots more to be said, but I'm pleased we learned. I'm pleased we learned. Be'ezrat Hashem, our intensive learning should be as chus for Am Yisrael in this difficult time. Be'ezrat Hashem, that all our boys and girls can do their bit, and the Kodesh Baruch should look after them. And Be'ezrat Hashem, we should be victorious. Victory is not about joy. Victory is about safety. Victory is enough. There's no more massacres of Jews. That we said Av Rachmim on Shabbos for an event that didn't happen hundreds of years ago. It happened a week ago, less than an hour away from where I live. that's where we are right now. We need to be successful so that, please God, this should never, ever happen again. I wish you all well. Thank you, Melissa, for everything. And of course, give Melissa feedback. And Be'ezrat Hashem will continue learning this wonderful sefer from this great Gaon to help us better understand how to live a good Jewish life.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Should all be well and take care.
Stay safe. Anyone who's also staying for Rabbanit Shani's shiur, it's should be starting in about 9-10 minutes on the same link, so you can leave it on in the background, put yourself on mute or whatever you would like, and go get yourself a cup of coffee or something and come back in 10 minutes.